The security guard looked at me, then glanced back at the photo on his computer and shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You are not Mr. Harrison's wife." I smiled, thinking it was a terrible joke. 40 years of marriage, 2 children, an entire life standing behind my husband's career. And with a single sentence, I suddenly became a stranger. Before I could react, the elevator doors opened. A woman nearly 20 years younger than me stepped out, her high heels clicking confidently against the marble floor. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison." Every employee lowered their head to greet her, and me, the real wife, stood there, frozen. But in that very moment, I made a silent decision. I would not leave. I would stay. And I would find out the truth, no matter the cost. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Margaret Lewis Harrison. I am 60 years old, a retired high school teacher in the state of Illinois. And until that morning, I firmly believed that I was the only woman who carried the Harrison name in my husband's life. 40 years. That number is not just time. It is an entire lifetime. Mornings when I woke up early to make coffee and prepare breakfast so Richard could drive to work on time. Evenings when I waited for him to come home late, reheated dinner, and told myself that men in leadership roles are just like that. The times I turned down career advancement to transfer schools for our children. The years I stood quietly behind him, believing that family was a shared achievement. Richard Harrison is my husband, the chief financial officer of a major real estate corporation in Chicago. He started as a young accountant and climbed step by step to a position everyone now respects. I still remember the day Richard received his first major promotion. I was standing in our small kitchen at the time, my hands trembling with happiness, thinking that all my sacrifices had finally meant something. In recent years, our marriage had lost its warmth. No more spontaneous hand-holding. No more long conversations on the couch on Friday nights. Richard came home later more often, seemed tired, sat silently in front of the television without really watching anything. I didn't suspect anything. I simply thought it was the natural result of age and responsibility. That was why, that morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a very long time: surprise my husband. I found a small invitation card in the pocket of Richard's suit jacket, printed with the company logo, a 35-year work anniversary at the firm, an internal meeting, no big celebration, no family invited. I smiled as I read it, thinking that maybe a small gesture was enough to remind him that behind all his success, there was still me. I chose a light blue floral dress that Richard once said made me look younger than my age. I tied my hair neatly and applied a soft shade of lipstick, something I rarely did after retirement. Before leaving the house, I looked at myself in the mirror and told myself that today was a good day, a normal, simple day of a wife visiting her husband. The building where Richard worked stood in downtown Chicago, its tall glass facade reflecting the pale gray sky of an autumn morning. I had been there a few times for year-end parties, but it had been a long time since I last returned. Everything looked more modern, colder than I remembered. As soon as I stepped into the lobby, I felt the security guard's gaze. He looked me up and down, not rudely, but with hesitation and scrutiny. I walked up to the reception desk and smiled as I had done for decades. "I'm here to see my husband, Richard Harrison," I said. "I'm Margaret Harrison." The receptionist looked up and typed a few lines on her computer. The smile on her face faltered, then turned into something hard to define. She glanced at the security guard. They exchanged a look so quick that I might have missed it if I hadn't been paying attention. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked. That question made me pause. I had come here many times before. I had never needed an appointment to see my husband. "I'm his wife," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "I just want to go up and say hello for a moment." The security guard stepped closer. He asked for my identification. I began to feel uneasy, but I still pulled out my wallet and handed him my driver's license. I saw his eyes scan my name, then narrow slightly. That was when he said the sentence that tore my life apart. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You are not Mr. Harrison's wife." In that moment, I truly thought I had misheard him. I smiled. An automatic smile. The reflex of someone who had learned to maintain dignity. I was about to say that he must be mistaken, that my husband and I had been married for over 40 years. But before I could open my mouth, the elevator behind me opened. That woman stepped out, younger than me, in her early 40s, brown hair neatly styled, a well-fitted office dress, the confident posture of someone completely at home in this space. She didn't look at me. She looked straight at the receptionist and the security guard. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison." The way they said that name, Harrison, was so light, so natural, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She nodded in response and walked on unhurriedly. No one asked for her identification. No one stopped her. In that moment, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood still. It felt as if all the sound around me had disappeared, leaving only the steady click of her high heels against the marble floor, each step striking directly into my chest. I understood one thing very clearly. This was not a secret affair, not a momentary mistake. That woman had a position. She had recognition, at least in this building. My mind began replaying fragments of memory, late meetings, sudden business trips, the way Richard avoided my eyes when I asked if he was tired. Saturday nights when he said he had paperwork to finish. I had thought it was just work. Now, each small detail lined up into a cold, undeniable truth. I could have turned away. I could have left that building in humiliation. But I didn't. Maybe it was my age. Maybe 40 years of sacrifice wouldn't allow me to run away like a defeated person. Or maybe there was a part of me, very deep and very stubborn, that needed to know the truth all the way through. I turned back to the reception desk. My voice was strangely calm. "Excuse me," I said. "I have a short interview with Human Resources. I arrived a little early." The receptionist looked at me, hesitating for a few seconds. Maybe I didn't look like a troublemaker. Maybe my age made them careless. She nodded and pointed toward the elevator on the right. "8th floor," she said. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, reflecting my face in the dull metal surface. A 60-year-old woman, hair streaked with gray, eyes no longer as gentle as before. I pressed the button, feeling my heart pound so hard it seemed anyone standing beside me could hear it. As the elevator began to rise, I understood that I had willingly stepped into my own nightmare. But I also knew that from this moment on, I would no longer be the woman who closed her eyes and trusted blindly. I would be the one who asked questions, who observed, who faced the truth, no matter how cruel it might be. The elevator doors closed behind me, lifting me upward while my mind drifted far back to the years I once believed were the most solid, the safest, and also the years in which I had never once seriously asked myself, was I being betrayed? 40 years ago, Richard and I met when we were both very young. I was a college student studying education, carrying simple dreams, to become a good teacher, to have a small family, a warm home, and a life rich in meaning. Richard was different. He was ambitious, driven, always looking ahead, but it was that very difference that drew us together. I believed love could fill any gap. We married when I was 23. The wedding was small, not lavish. A simple ceremony in a local church with family and close friends present. I still clearly remember the moment Richard held my hand and whispered that he would take care of me for the rest of his life. I believed him completely without a single doubt. At that age, I thought that as long as two people tried together, nothing was impossible. The early years of marriage were not easy. Richard started his career at a very low position. The pay was modest, the pressure high. I taught full-time, managing the household and saving every dollar. There were evenings when we sat at a small dining table, eating simple meals, talking about the future as if it were guaranteed. All we needed was a little more patience. When our children were born, life became even busier. I once had the opportunity to take a senior academic position at my school, a step many colleagues dreamed of, but it would have meant staying later, attending weekend training programs, and traveling often. Richard was at a crucial stage of his career. After many sleepless nights, I turned down the opportunity. I told myself the family needed me more, that there would be time for myself later. One refusal, then another. Gradually, I became used to stepping back, not because I was forced, but because I believed it was the right choice. Richard needed a stable support system. The children needed a mother who was always present, and I was proud that I could be that person. Richard advanced year by year. Every time he was promoted, I was the first to hear the news. I was the one standing in the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine, cooking better than usual meals to celebrate. I remember the light in his eyes, the way he held me and said he couldn't have done it without me. Those words became my emotional anchor, convincing me that every sacrifice had value. Over time, a distance began to form between us. Very slowly, very quietly, so quietly that I didn't notice at first. Richard worked more. Meetings ran longer. Business trips became more frequent. At first, he still told me about his work, his colleagues, the pressures of his new role. I listened and encouraged him, as I always had. But those stories gradually became fewer. Richard came home later, ate dinner in silence, sometimes only nodded instead of answering. I asked if he was tired. He said he was fine. I asked if he needed rest. He said the work wasn't finished. I became used to not asking more. In recent years, Richard's changes became more obvious. He often came home very late. Some nights I was already asleep when he returned, and in the morning he left before I woke up. We lived under the same roof, but the time we truly spent together grew smaller and smaller. I saw his fatigue, his fading smile, the sense that he was always somewhere far away, even when sitting across from me. I once wondered whether we were slowly becoming strangers, but the thought never lasted long. I pushed it aside, convincing myself that this was normal for couples who had been together for decades. That passion couldn't last forever. That mature love was quieter and more enduring. I told myself Richard worked hard for the family, for the children, for the future. I believed his exhaustion was the price of success, and I accepted that price, as I had accepted so many things throughout this marriage. We no longer had big arguments, no more fights. Everything was smooth to the point where I once thought it was a good sign. No conflict, no drama, a stable, peaceful marriage. I called it safe. I never doubted Richard's loyalty. Not because I was naive, but because I believed some men, no matter how many temptations they face, still keep boundaries. Richard was always principled. He wasn't the type who enjoyed parties, who showed off, who flirted. At least that was how I saw him. I never checked his phone, never tracked his schedule. I respected my husband's privacy and believed that respect was the foundation of a lasting relationship. I believed that if he had something to say, he would tell me. That absolute trust became the perfect blindfold. It made me overlook the smallest signs. When Richard changed his computer password, I thought it was a company security requirement. When he took his phone into the bathroom, I thought it was a harmless habit. When he replied to late-night messages evasively, I thought it was work. I built a world for myself where everything had a reasonable explanation, where there was no place for betrayal. I believed that after 40 years, if something were wrong, I would feel it. I trusted my intuition, not knowing that intuition can be numbed by habit and long-standing trust. Standing in the rising elevator, I suddenly realized that the most painful thing was not seeing another woman called Mrs. Harrison. The most painful thing was realizing that for many years I had lived in a false sense of safety, that I had placed my entire trust in a marriage whose foundation I had never once examined. I don't blame myself for believing. Belief itself is not wrong. But I began to understand that it was precisely that unconditional trust that made today's shock so brutally cruel. If I had ever doubted, perhaps I would have been mentally prepared. If I had ever asked questions, perhaps I would not have stood frozen in that lobby. The elevator slowed. A soft chime sounded. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. 40 years of marriage that I once believed was solid was now being examined under an entirely different light, and I knew that once these doors opened, I could never return to being the woman who trusted without question. The elevator stopped with a very soft sound, as if it didn't want to startle me. The doors slid open, revealing a space completely different from the lobby below. It was quieter here, the white lighting softer, everything arranged with near-clinical neatness. This was the executive floor, where Richard had spent most of his adult life. I stepped out slowly, forcing my posture to look as natural as possible. No one noticed me right away, and that brought both relief and pain. Relief because I wasn't stopped. Pain because I realized that in this space, my existence seemed to carry no weight. I stood near the main hallway where I could see the private reception area of the executive floor. From there, I observed. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I only knew that I needed to see, to hear, to understand. And then I saw her, Lauren. She wasn't wearing a coat, wasn't carrying a handbag like a visitor. She walked out of a small conference room holding a thin folder, her manner so familiar that no one needed to ask how long she had been there. A middle-aged man stood up to greet her, calling her name, warmly. Another woman smiled and asked if she wanted coffee. No one looked surprised by her presence. No one watched her with suspicion. She was an obvious part of this place. I stood there silently, feeling as though I were watching a play in which the lead role had been given to someone else long ago, while I was just a late-arriving audience member, never told that the story had already taken a different turn. The way they spoke to Lauren wasn't how people spoke to an ordinary colleague. There was closeness, familiarity built over years of working together. There was respect, and there was warmth. One man joked that lunch at the Italian restaurant yesterday had been wonderful. Another woman asked whether Lauren would take the kids out this weekend. The kids. I felt a slight tightening in my chest, just enough to make me take a deep breath. I didn't know whose children they were talking about. I didn't want to guess. But the pieces in my mind began to shift, quietly and terrifyingly. Then I heard that name, clearly, unmistakably. Lauren Bennett Harrison. The woman standing near the reception desk said the name as she transferred a call. Her voice was natural, as if it were a familiar name she had spoken hundreds of times. Harrison. That last name used to be mine, the name I carried for 40 years, through every stage of my life, the name I signed on my children's birth certificates, on property documents, on greeting cards sent to friends. And now it was attached to another woman, younger than me, standing just a few yards away, completely unaware that I existed. My heart tightened, not with ordinary jealousy, but with a deep sense of loss, as if a part of my identity had been taken from me and handed to someone else without my consent. I began to understand something I had been trying to avoid. Richard didn't just betray me in silence. He didn't just have a hidden relationship behind my back. He had built a parallel life, public, stable, long enough for everyone here to treat it as a given, a life in which there was no place for me. I took a few more steps, moving closer to the reception area on this floor. Immediately, a young woman looked up, her expression polite but distant. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to see Richard Harrison," I said, my voice sounding unfamiliar even to myself. "I'm his wife." The young woman looked at me, then at the screen in front of her, and typed a few lines. I saw hesitation flicker briefly in her eyes. Then she smiled, a perfectly professional smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "Mr. Harrison is in a meeting, and we don't have any appointment information for you. Not, he can't see you, not, please wait, but no record of me." I repeated it more slowly, as if clarity might change something. "I'm his wife." The young woman tilted her head slightly, a trace of confusion crossing her face, then turned to a man standing nearby, probably an assistant. They exchanged a look. I saw them speak quietly, but I didn't need to hear the words. I wasn't in the system. I didn't belong here. The man stepped forward, his tone polite but firm. "Ma'am, at this time we can't allow you into Mr. Harrison's private work area without prior confirmation." I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice, because in that moment I realized how fragile my position was. If I reacted emotionally, if I caused a scene, I would become an older woman making trouble, an inconvenience to be handled quickly. And I wasn't here to be escorted out. That feeling of rejection was unlike anything I had experienced before. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, cold, like a door closing that you never realized had been open. I felt as if I had been erased from a part of a life I once believed was mine. I looked around again. Everyone continued with their work. Lauren walked past talking to someone, smiling lightly. No one looked at me. No one realized that the woman standing against the wall was Richard Harrison's legal wife. In that moment, a powerful urge rose inside me to step forward, to call Richard's name loudly, to ask them who they thought I was. But I didn't do it. I had lived long enough to know that impulsive reactions rarely bring the truth. They only bring chaos. I chose silence. Silence not because I was weak, but because I needed to observe. I needed to remember every detail, every look, every word. I needed to understand how this picture had been drawn and for how long. In my mind, there was only one thought, so clear it didn't need to be spoken. I needed evidence, not for revenge, not to humiliate anyone, but to protect myself, so that when I faced Richard, and I knew that day was coming very soon, I wouldn't have only emotions, but facts. I stood there a few more minutes, long enough to be certain this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be explained with a simple apology. Then I turned and walked toward the hallway leading to the conference rooms. My heart beat slower than before, but heavier. Each step carried a new realization. The marriage I once believed was solid had been built on spaces I was never invited into. And I understood that from this moment on, I was no longer a woman living in blind trust. I was someone standing in a place that didn't belong to her, quietly gathering the pieces of a truth that had been hidden for many years. I stood still for a few more seconds, long enough for my heartbeat to slow. No one noticed me. In this place, the silence of an older woman didn't spark curiosity or concern. I realized that was both cruel and my only advantage right now. I continued down the hallway leading into the executive meeting area. When the receptionist on this floor looked up again, I lowered my head slightly and smiled, keeping my voice low and steady. I arrived early for a short discussion with Human Resources, I said, avoiding direct eye contact. They told me I could wait in this area. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Maybe I looked more like a retired teacher than a troublemaker. Maybe no one imagined that a woman my age would have any reason to cause problems on the executive floor. I walked past without being stopped. The hallway was long and quiet, covered in dark gray carpet, evenly lit with no windows. Conference rooms lined both sides, their frosted glass doors revealing long tables, black leather chairs, ceiling-mounted projectors. The faint smell of coffee hung in the air, so familiar it hurt. Richard used to tell me that the smell of coffee at the office helped him stay alert. I had made coffee for him every morning, for decades. I slowed my steps when I heard voices ahead, not Richard's, but voices I guessed had known him for a long time. I stopped at the corner of the hallway, leaning close to the wall, a habit formed during my years as a teacher. Listen before entering an unfamiliar space. "Is Mr. Harrison having lunch with Lauren today?" a man asked casually. "Of course," a female voice replied with a hint of teasing. "Every Thursday. Their usual restaurant." There. The word was soft, but it landed like a weight on my chest. I pressed my back against the wall, my hand unconsciously tightening around my purse strap. I couldn't see them, only hear their voices. Natural, unguarded. "I heard Lauren made the reservation earlier today," the man continued. "Sounds like they want to discuss something important." "Probably the new project," the woman replied. "Lauren always arranges everything so carefully for Mr. Harrison." I closed my eyes for a brief second. Lauren. That name was no longer distant. It echoed here with a familiarity I had never had, not whispered as a secret. Not avoided, but part of the daily rhythm of this place. I stood there listening, each sentence like a slow, precise cut. They talked about lunch, about restaurants, about routines, small details that only long-term relationships have. No one lowered their voice. No one sounded cautious. Then the conference room door ahead opened. I didn't have time to step farther back. I stood still, half hidden by the wall. Richard walked out with two other men. He looked exactly as he always did. Dark suit, quick stride, the familiar face I had looked at for 40 years. In that moment, my heart tightened in a completely different way. Not panic, not trembling, but a terrifying stillness. "I have lunch with Lauren today," Richard said calmly, as if confirming a meeting. "We'll continue this later." From his own mouth. No hesitation, no cover-up, no doubt. My world didn't collapse loudly like in the movies. It didn't explode. It froze. Everything around me became sharply clear, the lights, the footsteps, the rustle of papers, and I became empty. A cold sensation spread from my chest to my stomach, then through my limbs. I stopped shaking. I didn't want to cry. I just stood there as if part of me had stepped outside myself to observe everything from a distance. All doubt ended in that moment. No more maybe, no more what if, no more I'm overthinking. The truth stood right in front of me, so clear it didn't need any further proof. Richard didn't just betray me. He had lived another life, openly, in plain sight, among people I had never been introduced to. I watched him turn and walk toward his private office. None of the others noticed me. I was just a faint figure in a long hallway, someone who didn't belong here. And strangely enough, that helped me stay calm. I understood that if I kept standing there, hiding, I would always be an eavesdropper, always an outsider. I had seen enough to know I couldn't go home and pretend I hadn't heard anything, enough to understand that if I didn't confront this now, I might never get another chance. I took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to keep my voice from shaking. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder, smoothed the skirt of my dress, a familiar reflex from years before stepping into a classroom. I was no longer a teacher standing before students, but I was still a woman who had lived long enough to know there are moments you cannot avoid. I stepped out from the shadows and walked straight toward Richard's office door. The door was slightly open. I saw his back as he placed a folder on the desk. His office was spacious, orderly, exactly his style. On the bookshelf were the economics books he used to read in the evenings. On the desk was a framed family photo, taken 10 years earlier before the children married. I had dusted that frame countless times. I knocked. Not loud, not soft, just enough for him to hear. "Come in," Richard said without turning around. I opened the door and stepped inside. The moment he turned and his eyes met mine, I knew I didn't need to say much anymore. Every explanation, every excuse, every denial became meaningless in that instant. His face changed quickly, from surprise to shock, then to panic, a reaction I had seen many times before when students were caught cheating on a test. "Margaret?" he blurted out, his voice rough. What are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, looking at the man I had called my husband for 40 years, not to find familiarity, but to confirm that I was seeing him with my own eyes, without the filter of trust. The panic in his eyes was the clearest answer. In that moment, I understood I had crossed a line I could never step back over. I was no longer the woman standing in the hallway listening to fragmented conversations. I had walked straight into the center of the truth, and whatever happened next, I knew that from this point on, I would no longer be passive. I remained standing in front of Richard's desk, not taking another step forward, not out of fear, but because I needed that distance to avoid doing something I might regret. The room was so quiet I could hear the steady hum of the air conditioner, even the uneven breathing of the man in front of me. Richard stood up from his chair, then sat back down as if he didn't know what to do with his body. He ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture whenever he was unsettled. I had seen it countless times over 40 years whenever he faced a difficult decision. The difference now was that I was the one trapped without an escape. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I can explain." I nodded slightly, like a teacher allowing a student to begin an answer. I didn't sit down. I didn't lean on anything. I wanted to stay alert. "Go ahead," I said. My voice was so calm it surprised even me. "I'm listening." Richard swallowed hard. He glanced toward the door as if considering whether someone might overhear, then looked back at me. In that moment, I saw how much he had aged, not from years, but from the cracking of the solid shell I had once trusted. I met Lauren 15 years ago. He began slowly, each word dragged from his chest. During a long business trip in California. At the time, I wasn't looking for anything. It just happened. I didn't react. I didn't ask why. I just looked at him and let him continue. She worked with one of our partner teams, he said. Smart, calm. At first, it was just lunches, work discussions. I knew it was wrong, but I thought I could control it. I listened as if hearing a cold report. No extra details, no emotion, just a sequence of events arranged to sound reasonable. Then it went beyond control, he continued, his voice dropping. I tried to stop. I really did. My hand tightened around my purse strap. In my mind, I saw the evenings I sat alone in the kitchen, waiting for him to come home late, telling myself his work was always demanding. Lauren got pregnant, Richard said. The sentence fell between us without echo or sound, but I felt a heavy force press down on my chest. I didn't step back. I didn't cover my mouth. I just stood there, receiving it as a final truth that could not be undone. I panicked, he continued. I thought about telling you many times, but every time I looked at you, looked at the kids, I didn't know where to begin. I tilted my head slightly. So you chose not to tell me, I said. It wasn't a question. Richard nodded slowly. I thought, if I kept everything stable, if I didn't let it affect the family, then maybe that was the least harmful way. I gave a small laugh, not a happy one, but a very brief, quiet sound, like the reflex of someone who has just heard something too absurd to be real. You thought silence was a way to protect me? I asked. Or a way to protect yourself? Richard lowered his head, didn't answer right away. His silence said more than any explanation could. You live two lives, I said, each word clear. One with me, one with her, and you call that stability. I'm sorry, Richard said quickly. I never wanted to hurt you. I was afraid of losing you. I looked at him for a long time. Maybe for the first time in years, I wasn't looking at him as a wife, but as someone assessing the truth in front of her. You were afraid of losing me, I repeated. But you weren't afraid of losing honesty. You weren't afraid of losing trust. You weren't afraid of letting me live in a lie for 15 years. Richard reached out his hand, then stopped halfway, as if remembering that he no longer had the right to touch me. I arranged everything, he said. I thought I could manage it. Work, family, responsibilities. I never neglected you or the kids. I took a deep breath. Do you know that every time you said, I'll be home late tonight, it was a lie? I asked. Every time you said you had an unexpected business trip? Every time you walked into the house looking exhausted and silent? Richard didn't respond. I knew he understood. I suddenly realized that for 15 years, I had been living inside a script that was already written, one where I always played the trusting wife, and he played the hard-working family man. Every detail I had accepted without question now stood out clearly, sharply, impossible to deny. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't slam my hand on the desk. Maybe because my tears had already run dry the moment I heard Lauren's name spoken in the hallway. Or maybe because, in this moment, I no longer had the energy to be angry. I just felt deeply tired, as if I had walked a very long road to arrive at a place I could never return from. I didn't come here to argue, I said. And I didn't come here to listen to your justifications." Richard looked up, his eyes full of confusion. "Then, why did you come?" I looked around his office, the room where he had built his power, his reputation, and another part of his life. I thought of the family photo on his desk, the picture that now suddenly felt out of place. "I came to know the truth," I said, "and now I do." I turned and walked toward the door. Richard called my name, his voice breaking. "Margaret, please, we can talk more. I'll explain everything. We can figure something out." I stopped with my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't turn around. "No," I said very softly but firmly. "There is no we here anymore." I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. No one paid attention to me. The men and women outside continued with their work, their everyday conversations. The world didn't stop just because my marriage had collapsed. I walked straight to the elevator and pressed the button. When the doors closed, I finally allowed myself to let out a long breath. I didn't cry. I just felt empty. As the elevator went down, I looked at my reflection in the dim mirror. A 60-year-old woman standing straight, her eyes no longer unfocused. I knew very clearly that what I had left behind wasn't just Richard's office, but a marriage that had been dead for a long time. Only today, I had officially laid it to rest, and I also knew that when I stepped out of that building, I would never return in my old role again. I walked out of the building when the sun was higher than when I arrived, but the light didn't make me feel any warmer. The wind swept across the plaza in front of the entrance, carrying early fallen yellow leaves that brushed lightly against my feet before drifting away. Everything continued as usual. Cars, pedestrians, distant horns. Only I felt as if I had been pulled out of a familiar orbit. I drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls. I needed that quiet, like a fragile buffer between what I had just learned and what I was about to face. The road home was so familiar I could drive it without looking at the signs. I had taken this route for decades, driving the kids to school, going grocery shopping, coming home after teaching. Today, it felt longer than usual. The house came into view, the house I had once called home, the white painted front, the maple trees in the yard that had grown tall over the years, their branches nearly covering the living room windows. I turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment, my hands still on the steering wheel. Not because I wasn't ready to go inside, but because I wanted to remember this feeling, the feeling of standing in front of something familiar, knowing I was about to see it with different eyes. Inside, everything was the same. There was no sign that life here had ever been shared with another woman. Richard's coat still hung on the hook by the door. The shoes he wore most often were neatly placed under the shelf. The familiar scent of wood and mild cleaner still lingered in the air. If not for this morning, I would have thought everything was intact. I set my purse down on the table, took off my coat, and stood in the middle of the living room, unsure where to begin. I wasn't looking for an emotional outburst. I was looking for the truth. And I knew that if Richard had managed to hide another life from me for 15 years, there had to be traces. I went upstairs and entered our bedroom. That room had once been the place where I felt safest. Now it was simply a space that needed to be examined. I opened Richard's closet. Everything was arranged as neatly as ever, suits hanging by color, shirts folded carefully, ties rolled in a drawer. Nothing looked unusual on the surface. I began searching through the drawers, calmly, without panic. I had taught long enough to know that the truth rarely sits in obvious places. I checked the pockets of old suit jackets, the lower drawers where Richard kept, things he rarely used. Then I saw it. A small, dark wooden box tucked deep inside, hidden behind thick winter socks. The box wasn't large, but it felt heavier than I expected when I picked it up. It had a small lock. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. Richard had never mentioned it. I tried to open it, but it was locked. In that moment, I didn't hesitate. I opened the vanity drawer, took out the small scissors I used to cut loose threads, and gently pried at the lock. There was a dry click. The lid popped open. Inside were neatly arranged documents, as if someone had carefully organized their secret life. I took them out one by one and laid them on the bed. A lease agreement for an apartment on the other side of the city in Richard's name. The lease had started 15 years ago and had been renewed regularly. I recognized the area, not far from where his company once had a branch office. Next were bank statements, an account I had never known about, regular transfers, consistent, stretching over many years. Not impulsive spending from a temporary affair, but planned, responsible financial support. I didn't need to be an accountant to understand that. Then there were photographs. I picked up the first one, my heart sinking. Richard stood beside Lauren, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. They were at a beach, sunlight bright around them. His smile, the smile I hadn't seen in years. The next photo showed Richard holding a small child, then the child growing older in each frame. Birthdays, parks, dinner tables, a complete family recorded over time. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the photos spread out in front of me. There was nothing left to deny, nothing left to explain away. This wasn't a mistake. This was another life built alongside mine. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't in pain, but because every tear seemed frozen. I just sat there, looking at the undeniable evidence, letting the truth sink in. 15 years. While I lived with a husband I trusted completely, he had been a father to another child, a partner to another woman. I don't know how long I sat there. When I finally stood up, the light outside the window had shifted toward afternoon. I gathered the documents and placed them back into the wooden box, leaving it unlocked. There was no need anymore. I heard a car pull up outside. A car door closing. Richard was home. My heartbeat slowed. Steadier now. I realized I was ready for this moment, even though I hadn't planned it. Richard walked into the house and called my name as usual. His voice echoed from downstairs, carrying the familiar tiredness. I picked up the wooden box and walked down the stairs. When he saw me standing there with the box in my hands, his eyes darkened. He understood immediately. No explanation was needed. "Margaret," he began. I raised my hand, signaling him to stop. "You don't need to say anything else," I said. My voice was steady. "I've seen enough." Richard stood still. His shoulders slumped, as if he finally no longer had the strength to hold himself upright. He looked at the box, then at me. I no longer saw the powerful man from earlier that day, just someone stripped of every disguise. "I want you to leave this house," I said slowly, each word deliberate. "Tonight." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He took a deep breath, then shook his head. "Margaret, we can talk. I'll explain. No," I interrupted. Not loudly, but firmly. "There's nothing left to explain. You had 15 years to talk. I don't owe you another minute." He looked around the house, as if only now realizing it was about to no longer be his. "This is my home," he said weakly. "No," I replied. "This was our home once, but you chose to live somewhere else a long time ago." Silence stretched between us. Finally, Richard nodded very slightly. He turned and went upstairs to pack. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening to drawers open, clothes being pulled out. Each sound felt like a final period. When he came back down with a small suitcase, I opened the door for him. No tears, no pleading, just a clear ending that couldn't be reversed. The door closed behind Richard. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the doorknob. Then I turned back inside, closed the door, and locked it. For the first time in my life, I didn't compromise. I didn't convince myself to accept what was unacceptable. I didn't stay in a marriage that had been dead for a long time. I stood in the quiet house, took a deep breath, and knew that whatever lay ahead, I had just done the only thing left for me to do: choose myself. The next morning, I woke up very early, even though I had barely slept. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. No familiar footsteps in the kitchen, no refrigerator door opening, no soft cough I had heard for decades. I got up, put on my robe, and walked through the house, as if to confirm that I was truly alone now. The first thing I did was call a locksmith to change all the locks, not out of hatred, but because I needed a clear boundary. When the locksmith asked if I was sure, I nodded without hesitation. The old keys were removed, placed into his toolbox, and disappeared from my life in a very ordinary way. I realized that sometimes the biggest changes happen quietly. After that, I called a lawyer a friend had recommended years ago, someone I never thought I would need. The woman on the other end of the line was calm and professional. I didn't go into details. I simply said I needed advice about a divorce after many years of marriage, involving assets and long-term infidelity. She didn't sound surprised. She just scheduled a meeting later that week. When I hung up, I sat still for a moment, realizing I had taken another step away from my old life. But the hardest part was still ahead. I called my 2 children, one by one. I asked them to come over that evening, saying I had something important to talk about in person. My voice sounded normal, even to me. Maybe because if I had let the emotions surface then, I wouldn't have been able to finish the sentence. Both of them sensed something was wrong, but neither pressed for details. The afternoon passed slowly. I tidied the living room and brewed a pot of tea, as if preparing for an ordinary conversation, but nothing about that day was ordinary. When the doorbell rang, my heart tightened. My son came in first, followed by my daughter. Both looked around the house, then at me, their faces full of concern. "What's going on, Mom?" my daughter asked, gripping my hand tightly. I motioned for them to sit down. I sat across from them, my hands resting on my knees. I took a deep breath. I had stood in front of classrooms for decades, spoken about difficult topics with students, but I had never felt that telling the truth could be so heavy. "Your father doesn't live here anymore," I began. Both of them froze. My son frowned. "Did Dad go on a business trip?" I shook my head slowly. "No, your father has been living another life for 15 years. The air in the room thickened. I saw my daughter's eyes widen, as if she didn't understand what I had just said. My son sat up straight, his voice tense. "What are you saying?" I didn't go around it. I told them, without embellishment, without excuses. I spoke about the other woman, about 15 years of lies, about a child born from that relationship. I didn't give unnecessary details. I only said what needed to be said, what they had the right to know. When I finished, the room fell silent. My daughter lowered her head, tears falling onto her sleeve. My son stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his hands clenched. "That's impossible," he said. "Dad wouldn't do that." I stood up and placed my hand on his shoulder. "I used to think so too," I said softly. That moment hurt more than anything Richard had done to me. Watching my children who had trusted their father completely, now forced to face this truth, felt like my heart was being torn apart. His betrayal of me was one thing, but the collapse I saw in my children's eyes, that was what nearly took my breath away. Does that mean we have a sister? My daughter asked, her voice shaking. I nodded. Yes. The answer left them both silent, not out of jealousy, but because too many emotions collided at once. Shock, confusion, pain, and a sense of loss they couldn't yet name. She's not at fault, I said immediately, before anything else could be said. No matter how hard this is to accept, that child is completely innocent. She didn't choose the circumstances she was born into. My son stopped pacing and looked at me. There was an anger in his eyes I had never seen before. Dad did this to you, he said. He did this to our family. I nodded. I know, but I won't turn this into a campaign to destroy him. I don't need to tear your father down to prove anything. The truth is heavy enough on its own. I looked at each of them. Your father was wrong. Very wrong. But I don't want you to carry hatred for the rest of your lives. You have the right to be angry, the right to be disappointed. But I hope you remember that how you face this also says something about who you are. My daughter broke down, leaning into my shoulder. I held her, feeling her body tremble. My son stood there, eyes red, struggling to hold himself together. I knew each of them was reacting in their own way. There was no right or wrong response in that moment. My family, my daughter choked up. Are we still a family, Mom? I stroked her hair, my voice slow but steady. Our family has been hurt, but we haven't lost our dignity. I haven't lost myself, and neither have you. I looked around the room, the place that once held laughter, dinners, and conversations that seemed ordinary at the time. A family isn't defined only by a marriage, I said. It's defined by how the people in it treat one another when everything falls apart. We sat together for a long time that night. There were questions I couldn't answer. There were emotions I could only listen to. I didn't force my children to forgive. I didn't ask them to take sides. I only said that I had made a decision for my own life and I would take responsibility for it. When my children left, the house fell silent again. But this time, I didn't feel as empty as I had the night before. I was exhausted, but it was a meaningful kind of exhaustion. I knew I had just been through one of the hardest conversations of my life, and I hadn't avoided it. I stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom and looked at the woman reflected there. No longer a wife standing behind a successful man. No longer someone who constantly compromised to keep the peace. I saw a woman standing upright, even though her shoulders were still heavy. My family had fallen apart in a way I never imagined, but I wasn't broken. I hadn't lost my self-respect, and in that moment I understood that from this day on, I would no longer live as Richard's wife. I began to stand up, not with anger, but with the clarity of a woman who had finally chosen to step out of someone else's shadow and walk on her own feet. 3 days after the night I told my children the truth, when the house had finally returned to the slow rhythm of someone living alone, my phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering, as if my body already knew who was on the other end. Margaret? A woman's voice said, low and hesitant. This is Lauren. I didn't answer right away. I sat down in the armchair near the window, where the afternoon sunlight usually slanted through the curtains. In that moment, I didn't feel angry. I just felt deeply tired, as if I had walked a long road without stopping to rest. I know, I said after a few seconds. My voice was calm, not trembling at all. Richard told me, that you know everything now," Lauren continued. "I'm not calling to apologize on his behalf. I thought we should meet, if you think that's possible." I was silent. Part of me wanted to refuse immediately. I didn't owe that woman any explanation. But another part of me, the part that no longer ran away, understood that some meetings aren't for reconciliation, but for closure. "All right," I said, "once." We agreed to meet at a small cafe far from both my neighborhood and Richard's office area. I arrived 10 minutes early, not to wait, but to choose a seat that made me feel safe. I sat with my back to the wall, facing the door, a new habit I couldn't remember learning. Lauren walked in right on time. I recognized her immediately, even though she was dressed far more simply than the day I saw her at the office. No high heels, no fitted dress, just a neutral coat, dark jeans, her hair neatly tied back. She looked around, then spotted me. Her eyes paused for a brief moment before she walked over to the table. "Thank you for coming," she said, sitting down across from me. I nodded. "Let's be direct," I replied. "I don't have much I want to hear." Lauren took a deep breath. "I understand." Neither of us ordered a drink right away. The air between us was tight, like a rope pulled too far, but there was no loud hostility. Just two women sitting across from each other, forced to truly see one another for the first time. "I knew about you from the beginning," Lauren said. She didn't avoid it. "Richard never said he was single." That didn't surprise me. It only confirmed what I had already guessed. I nodded slightly. "And yet you stayed," I said. "Yes," Lauren answered. "I told myself I wasn't the one breaking your family, that your marriage already had problems." I looked at her, neither smiling nor arguing right away. "You're very good at comforting yourself," I said. Not sarcastically, just honestly. Lauren lowered her head. "Maybe I am. I'm not proud of it." She told her story, not long-winded, no tears. She said she had never been a legal wife, never had the Harrison last name on any documents, never appeared openly at family events. She existed in a vague in-between, not a secret affair, but not a real wife either. "I lived like a wife without a name," she said, "in a rented apartment, at dinners without relatives, on holidays with just the three of us. 3 people, Richard, her, and the child. I used to believe I accepted that for my daughter," Lauren continued, "that I was sacrificing for her. But as time went on, I wasn't so sure anymore." I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, not through the eyes of a betrayed wife, but through the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to see that lies rarely have only one victim. "Do you know how I lived?" I asked. No anger, no accusation, just a question. Lauren shook her head. "I only knew you were there, like something taken for granted, like a shadow I tried not to look at directly." I exhaled softly. "I lived as a trusting wife," I said, "believing that silence meant peace, believing exhaustion was the price of success, believing that if I didn't ask questions, everything would be fine." We sat in silence for a moment. The server came by to ask for our order. I asked for hot tea. Lauren ordered black coffee. When the server left, I continued. "I didn't come here to forgive," I said, "and I don't think you need that from me." Lauren nodded. "I didn't expect it." "I just need to understand," I said, "so I don't carry hatred with me." Lauren looked at me, her expression softening for the first time. "If there's one thing I want you to know," she said, "it's that I never thought I won." I looked at her slowly. "I know. Because no one wins in a life built on division. Not the legal wife, not the woman on the sidelines, not the child born into silence. The only person who benefited for a very long time was Richard. I don't blame you, I said. Not because you were right, but because I don't want to keep focusing on the wrong place. Lauren closed her eyes briefly, as if releasing a breath she had been holding. Thank you for that, she said quietly. I stood up. I think we've said enough. Lauren stood as well. Margaret, she called, as I had already turned away. I stopped, but didn't turn around. Do you love him? I asked, surprising even myself. Lauren was silent for a long time. I don't know, she finally said. I think I loved the role I was given, and when that role disappeared, I'm not sure what I have left. I nodded, though she couldn't see it. I understand, I said. I walked out of the cafe and took a deep breath of the cool air outside. The feeling in my chest wasn't as heavy anymore, not because everything had been resolved, but because I no longer carried a distorted image of the other woman. She wasn't my enemy. She was part of the lie and had been hurt by it in her own way. The misplaced focus had never been on the two women standing on opposite ends of the story. It was on the man who chose silence for 15 years and called it protection. As I drove home, I realized my hands were no longer shaking. There was no tightness in my throat. I didn't forgive, but I didn't carry hatred either. And for me, at this stage of life, that already felt like a form of freedom. After that, time moved at a different pace, slower but clearer. No more days of waiting and uncertainty. No more guessing what time Richard would come home, whether he was tired, whether he was busy. My life no longer revolved around someone else, and at first that left me more confused than relieved. The divorce process moved faster than I expected, perhaps because Richard didn't resist. He signed every document quietly, exhausted. The assets were divided fairly, according to the law and according to what I deserved after 40 years together. The house remained mine. Part of his retirement was reallocated. There were no loud arguments, no painful tug of war. Everything ended in a cold, almost administrative way. And perhaps that was the most fitting end for a marriage that had been dead for a long time. The day I held the divorce decree in my hands, I didn't cry. I didn't feel victorious either. I only felt a door closing behind me, softly but decisively. I stood outside the lawyer's building, watching people pass by, and for the first time in many years, I had no one to call, no one to share that moment with. And strangely, I didn't feel as empty as I had feared. In the days that followed, I began doing very small things, but for myself. I cleared out the room that had once been Richard's office. I took down the plaques, the old documents, the books he had left behind, not in anger, but with clarity. I repainted the walls a lighter color and placed a small wooden desk near the window. I bought a few green plants. The room gradually became something else, no longer marked by a powerful man, but by a woman learning how to live again. I found my old notebooks, yellowed pages where I had once written, scattered thoughts back when I was teaching. I started writing again. Not to tell Richard's story, but to listen to my own voice. I wrote about quiet mornings, about sunlight falling across the wooden floor, about the feeling of making tea for someone, myself, without needing to ask what they preferred. Some afternoons, I sat in the living room for a long time without turning on the television or playing music, just sitting there, listening to the ticking of the clock. At first, the silence made me uncomfortable. I had grown used to always having someone nearby, even if it was just a quiet presence. But slowly I realized silence wasn't an enemy. It was simply a space that had never been filled with my own voice. I learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. Some evenings I ate a simple meal and washed the dishes right away, not leaving them for the next day. Some mornings I woke up later than usual, brewed coffee, and read the newspaper slowly. I didn't have to report my schedule to anyone. I didn't have to adjust my habits to suit someone else. Those small things, which I had never thought about before, now brought me a strange sense of freedom. I called old friends, people I had been telling someday when I have time for years, without ever having time. We met at small restaurants and talked about things unrelated to family or responsibility. Some knew my story, some didn't. I no longer felt the need to explain my life to everyone. I only needed to be present as I was. One friend invited me to join an evening painting class. I almost refused out of habit, then stopped myself. I remembered that I used to enjoy painting a long time ago. So I went. I sat in a room filled with the scent of oil paint, holding a brush that felt unfamiliar, and let the colors spread freely across the paper. No one judged. No one compared. I didn't need to be good. I just needed to try. Solo trips came afterward naturally. At first, it was just a short drive to a coastal town I'd always wanted to visit, but kept postponing because it was inconvenient. I booked a small room, brought a book, and walked along the shore early in the morning. There was no one beside me, no one to talk to, but I didn't feel empty. I felt more observant of the waves, the birds, the strangers who were also walking alone. On those trips, I began to look back on my life through a different lens. I wasn't only a betrayed wife. I had been a dedicated teacher, a mother, a friend, and now I was an independent woman stepping into a new stage of life, even if that stage arrived later than I once imagined. There were still moments when sadness visited unexpectedly, like a cold gust of wind, seeing an elderly couple holding hands on the street, hearing an old song. Memories don't disappear just because you sign divorce papers, but they no longer controlled me. I allowed myself to remember, then allowed myself to move on. I realized I was slowly reclaiming my sense of self, not through dramatic changes, but through small, steady choices. I chose to wear the dress I liked without asking anyone's opinion. I chose to eat what I wanted. I chose to spend time on things that made me feel alive. Those choices, added together day after day, formed a person I thought I had lost. I no longer defined myself through marriage. I no longer introduced myself as someone's wife. When people asked if I was retired, I simply smiled and said I was enjoying a new chapter of life. No further explanation needed. One morning, I woke up and realized I was looking forward to the day, not because I had an appointment, not because I had something to do, but because I was curious how I would feel. That realization made me sit quietly on the bed for a long time, my hand resting on my chest, as if to make sure it was real. I wasn't younger. I hadn't forgotten the pain, but I was being reborn in the way of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that life isn't just about existing, but about being fully yourself, without a role to play. And for the first time in many years, that's how I felt I was living. I met Samuel Brooks on a very ordinary afternoon, in a way that, if someone had told me about it years earlier, I would have smiled politely and forgotten it. There was no fateful moment, no lightning strike glance, no racing heartbeat like in the stories people like to tell. Just a quiet afternoon and two people who had endured enough loss to no longer rush. That day, I went to the public library near my home to return a few books. It was early fall, the sunlight gentle, the air cool and fresh. I stopped at the magazine rack, flipping through a travel magazine about Europe that I was considering for an upcoming trip. As I put the magazine back, a man's voice spoke behind me, neither too close nor too far. "You like small towns? In the south of France, too?" I turned around. The man standing there was of average height, his gray hair neatly kept, wearing an old but clean jacket, his eyes calm and kind. Not the type trying to impress, no rushed, polite smile, just someone genuinely curious. "I've never been," I replied, "but I like the idea of places that aren't noisy." He nodded as if my answer confirmed something he had already guessed. "I went once, many years ago, when my wife was still alive." He said it naturally, without sadness, without avoidance. I immediately recognized someone who had lived with loss long enough not to hide it. We talked for a few more minutes, about books, about traveling without packed schedules, about living alone after children grow up. When we parted, he introduced himself as Samuel Brooks. I simply nodded and smiled, not thinking that the brief conversation would continue. But a week later, I saw him again at the same library. This time, we sat at a table near the window, each reading a different book, occasionally exchanging a few scattered remarks. No one asked for a phone number. No one suggested meeting again. Just the presence of two people who didn't feel uncomfortable sharing silence together. Everything unfolded so slowly, it was almost unnoticeable. A coffee afterward, then another walk in the park. Samuel always walked half a step slower than I did, as if unconsciously adjusting his pace to match mine. He never asked intrusive questions. He wasn't overly curious about my past. When I spoke, he listened. When I was silent, he didn't try to fill the space. No promises were made. No lines like, "We will be this," or "our future." And strangely, that was exactly what made me feel safe. I had lived with too many empty promises, words used to postpone the truth. With Samuel, there were no expectations placed on my shoulders. We met only when we both wanted to. Some weeks we didn't see each other at all. Some days we exchanged just a short message. "The weather is nice today." No one complained. No one checked up on the other. No one demanded anything. What made me realize the biggest difference wasn't in gestures, but in how I was listened to. When I spoke, Samuel didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to give advice. He didn't compare my story to anyone else's. He listened as if what I said truly mattered, not as something to endure until it was his turn to speak. Once, when I was talking about the years I had lived in silence in my former marriage, I stopped halfway, afraid I was saying too much. Samuel looked at me and said very softly, "You don't have to summarize your life for me. I have time." That sentence made me turn my face away for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed with emotion, but because I realized how long it had been since anyone had told me they had time for me, not out of obligation, but by choice. I told my children about Samuel after a few months, not to ask permission, but because I didn't want to hide anything. My daughter listened carefully, then smiled. "You look different, Mom," she said, "not because there's someone new, but because you feel lighter." My son asked a few more practical questions, as was his nature. What Samuel did, where he lived, whether he was serious. I answered honestly. I didn't know, and I didn't need to know right now. What reassured me was that neither of them objected. They could see that I wasn't losing myself in this relationship. I still lived in my own house. I still had my own routine. I still traveled alone. Samuel was part of my life, not the center of it. Once he asked if I'd like to go with him to a small concert in a nearby town. I agreed. We sat next to each other in the small hall, soft lights, music flowing slowly. Samuel didn't hold my hand. He simply rested his hand on the armrest, close enough for me to know he was there. I didn't feel like I was starting over. I felt like I was continuing, but as a different version of myself, a version that didn't need to sacrifice herself to keep the peace, didn't need to stay silent to avoid conflict, didn't need to play the role of the understanding woman by accepting everything. Samuel didn't make promises. He didn't talk about a distant future, but he was always there at the right moments. When I caught a cold, he brought over a bag of hot soup and left it at the door, not coming inside unless I invited him. When I traveled, he wished me a good trip and didn't ask who I was going with. When I came back, he listened to my stories without impatience. Happiness came to me very gently. It didn't overwhelm me. It didn't make me lose my guard. It was simply a sense of peace, knowing I could share space and time with someone without having to make myself smaller. One morning, I brewed coffee and stood by the window watching the sunlight rise. I realized I was smiling for no particular reason. I didn't need to name happiness. I just needed to live in it, slowly, clearly, and fully, in the way of a woman who had learned that love isn't a trade-off, but coexistence. I received a call from my son early one morning, when the house was still wrapped in a thin layer of quiet. His voice on the other end sounded deeper than usual, with a hint of hesitation before he got straight to the point. "Mom, Dad's been hospitalized." I was silent for a few seconds, not because I was shocked, but because I needed to identify my own feelings. The news didn't panic me. It passed through like a cold breeze, enough to remind me that some threads, even when cut, still leave marks. "What happened to him?" I asked, my voice even. "His heart," my son replied. "Not critical, but not minor either. The doctors want to monitor him." I looked out the window where the early sunlight was filtering through the curtains. Samuel had left early, leaving a short note on the kitchen table. "I have a routine checkup today. I'll stop by tonight if you want." I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. I knew I would have to make a decision, not out of duty, but out of clarity. "I'll come by tonight," I said to my son, "not to stay, just to visit." Hospitals always have a particular smell, the scent of disinfectant, of waiting, of time stretched thin. I walked into the lobby and followed the signs to the cardiology ward. Every step was steady. I wasn't going as a wife. I was going as someone who had once shared a long chapter of life with the person lying in that room. When I arrived, both of my children were already there. My daughter stood up first and hugged me lightly. My son nodded, his fatigue clearly visible. I spoke with the doctor, listened to the necessary information. Stable condition, needs rest, needs time. Familiar, neutral words carrying no emotion. Then the hospital room door opened. Lauren was standing there. She looked different from the last time I saw her. Thinner, dark circles under her eyes, her hair hastily tied back. Beside her stood a teenage girl, reserved, her hands clasped together. I recognized her immediately. No introduction needed. The child had Richard's eyes. The space between us froze. Two families, two lives that had once run parallel, now collided in a narrow hallway. There were no polite greetings, no challenging looks, just the heavy awkwardness of people placed in a situation no one had wished for. My daughter stepped forward naturally. "I'm Anna," she said to the girl. "If you want, we can sit together." The girl looked up at Lauren, then at Anna, and nodded very slightly. That moment tightened my chest, not with pain, but because I saw something adults often forget: Children don't carry adults' histories. They only carry their own confusion. I looked at Lauren. She looked back at me, her eyes no longer guarded, only tired. We didn't speak. There was no need. When it was my turn to go into the room, I went in alone. Richard lay on the bed, looking smaller than I remembered, not because illness had weakened him too much, but because in that stark white space, there were no titles, no roles, just a person. He opened his eyes when he heard the door. His gaze settled on me, startled at first, then softened. There was no panic, no expectation. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse. "Yes," I replied. I pulled a chair closer and sat down, keeping a respectful distance. "How are you?" "Better than this morning," he said. "The doctor says I need rest." We sat in silence for a moment, the steady hum of machines, footsteps in the hallway. I didn't know what I had come to say, but I knew I hadn't come to accuse him. I thought, "You wouldn't come," Richard said quietly. "I came," I replied without emphasizing the subject, "but not in the way you think." He looked up at the ceiling and took a deep breath. "I've thought a lot," he said, "in the past few hours. Times like this usually make people think," I said. "I regret it," he said, turning to look at me. Not just because everything fell apart, but because I thought I could control everything. I was wrong. I looked at him without avoiding his gaze. "I know." "I don't expect you to come back," he said quickly, as if afraid I might misunderstand. "I know, that's over." I exhaled, relieved by those words. "Yes," I said, "it's over." There were no pleas to return, no late promises, just the bare acknowledgement of someone who had reached the end of a life built on lies and realized it led nowhere. "Are you happy?" Richard asked very softly. The question came unexpectedly, but it didn't upset me. I thought of gentle sunlight in the morning, of coffee by the window, of Samuel in the way he never rushed to take up my space. "I'm at peace," I said, "and that's enough." Richard closed his eyes. I didn't know what he was thinking, and I didn't need to know. I stood up. "I'll let you rest," I said. "The kids are outside." He nodded. "Thank you for coming." I didn't reply. I just smiled very faintly and turned away. When the door closed behind me, I knew that was the last time I would step into the role of his past. There was nothing left to say. Out in the hallway, Lauren stood up when she saw me. She didn't come closer. She just looked at me, as if waiting for a signal. I nodded slightly. Not reconciliation, but acceptance that we had passed through the same pain in different ways. "Thank you," Lauren said. Just one word. I nodded again. "Take care of the girl," I said. "She needs stability." Lauren nodded, her eyes reddening. I turned to the girl. "You have beautiful eyes," I said. She looked surprised, then smiled shyly. That was enough. When I left the hospital, I paused outside for a moment and took a deep breath of the evening air. I called Samuel. "I'm done," I said. "I'm okay." "I'm on my way," he replied. "No rush. Take your time." I ended the call and walked slowly toward the parking lot. No resentment. No clinging. The past had knocked one last time, and I had opened the door, not to go back, but to see it out. As I drove home, the street lights came on one by one, illuminating the road ahead. I realized I was no longer carrying unanswered questions. I didn't need validation from my former life. I didn't need a dramatic ending. I only needed acceptance, and I had it. For the first time in many years, I felt truly free. The following spring arrived more gently than I expected. There was no grand moment marking it, no bells announcing a new beginning, just mornings with earlier sunlight, new buds appearing on the trees in the yard, and a sense of peace as I opened the windows and let the breeze flow through a house that now bore my own imprint. Samuel and I didn't talk much about big plans. We sat together at the kitchen table, spread out an old map, and marked a few places we wanted to visit when the weather warmed. A small coastal town he had once mentioned. A historic city I had always been curious about. No packed schedules, no long-term promises, just plans enough to make us smile when we thought about them. I liked the way Samuel asked for my opinion, listened, then nodded slowly, as if every choice deserved consideration. I no longer had to squeeze myself into someone else's plans. I was a companion, not someone walking behind. On weekends, my children and grandchildren came over more often. We cooked together, laughter filling the newly painted kitchen. I hung my paintings, placed green plants on the windowsills, replaced the sofa with a color I loved. The house was no longer a place that stored old compromises. It became a space shaped by choices I made with my own hands. Every corner told a new story, not loud, not showy, but warm enough to make people want to stay. Some afternoons, when everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the porch, listening to the wind move through the leaves. I realized I was no longer afraid of being alone. Silence was no longer a frightening void, but a place where I could rest. I knew how to brew a cup of tea just the way I liked it, when to go out and see others, and when to stay in. I didn't need anyone to fill my time. I just needed time lived at the right rhythm. Sometimes I looked back on the journey. From the moment I stood frozen in the company lobby, hearing someone else called by my title, to the night I changed the locks and told my children the truth, to the honest meeting with the other woman, to the day I signed the divorce papers and the first morning I woke up to a life no longer defined by marriage. I didn't romanticize the pain. I simply placed it where it belonged in memory, as pieces that had completed their purpose and no longer needed to be carried in my pocket every day. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't don't trust anyone, but don't lose yourself. Self-respect isn't loud. It shows up in small decisions, knowing when to say no, refusing to compromise with what hurts you, having the courage to stand upright before the truth. Identity isn't a label attached to a role. It's the inner feeling of living in alignment with your values, whether you're beside someone or alone. I am enough, even on my own, but I am also open enough to welcome the kind presence of another. Samuel walks beside me, not leading, not pulling me along. He walks with me, and that is enough. When we talk about the future, they aren't promises that make me lose the present, but plans that allow the present to be cherished more deeply. One morning, I hung a newly taken family photo on the wall. My children, my grandchildren, smiles that needed no explanation. I stepped back and looked at the house as a whole. The light fell in the right places. Nothing was perfect, but everything was real. I realized my new life hadn't begun on the day of the divorce, nor when I met Samuel. It began the moment I chose myself, and it continues every day I hold that choice steady. A new life doesn't announce itself loudly. It opens quietly when we stop being afraid. I don't know what challenges lie ahead, but I know I will face them with steadier feet, a wider heart, and a simple belief that I deserve my own peace. If you've walked with me all the way to these final lines, I want you to know that your presence is not small. Somewhere out there, you may be listening to this story on a quiet evening or in the middle of a long, thoughtful day, and that's enough for us to meet in the same emotional rhythm. Where are you listening from? What city or country? Please tell me, so I can feel how far this journey has reached you. If, in the pages of life I've just shared, there was a moment that made you pause, nod, or see yourself reflected there, please leave a comment, even just one sentence. I read every word with gratitude. And if you feel this story has given you a little warmth, a little courage to choose yourself, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can meet again in future stories. Life doesn't end when we lose something. It truly begins when we dare to live in alignment with our values. Thank you for listening and for being here.